So first, just want to say thanks to Luigi and the crew for having me here. It's really been a pleasure. This is such an unusual gathering. I think it's clearly a special and unique gathering in general, but certainly for me. A little closer? Yeah. Is that a little better? Yeah. Yes, okay, good. And so really it's been a pleasure to be here. Let me say just a quick word about sort of who I am and where I come from, just so that sort of contextualizes what I'm going to say. My training is in sort of history and sociology of science, or science and technology studies, if that means anything to anyone. And I, in the mode of a social scientist, study the ways in which, in domains of science and technology, judgments about good, bad, right, wrong, desirable, and undesirable are made. Through what institutions and practices of deliberation, drawing upon what forms of expertise, and why. And so if one understands questions of, well, what do we need to know in order to decide what is right? If one understands those relationships not as somehow given in advance, we already know what we need to know and who knows it, but rather as themselves products of a set of processes that say, well, this is how we should decide. This is the right way to imagine and aspire to the good. Well, those are political settlements just as much as they're epistemological ones. And so I try to understand those configurations because they shape our lives in profound ways. And yet, although we have a pretty good repertoire for asking questions about political power and authority, and asking questions about competing imaginations, competing value-laden judgments, we don't have very good modes for asking those kinds of questions of our institutions and regimes of knowledge-making, of the ways we know, and the worlds we bring into being as a result of the ways we know, and the ways we transform our knowledge into technique and technology. So that's the sort of frame in which I'm going to approach the things that I'm going to talk about today. And so this is our charge and my charge, the challenge of thinking through being human in a technological world. And you know, many times this challenge is understood in these terms, that the being human in a world is a pretty fixed and given thing. It's the technological that's changing. And so we have to focus on the technology, and so we wonder, is AI going to change us? Is biotechnology going to change us? Is our world going to be transformed by these technologies? Where those technologies come in and somehow perturb or transform a kind of existing status quo order. What I want to focus on in my talk is that, but also this. That the human is at stake in those technological projects. That the human is not some fixed and given in advance, in the sense that we sit inside of and are in constant relation in myriad mundane ways with our technologically constructed worlds. The ways we inhabit the world is a function of the ways we order that world epistemically and materially, as well as morally. Those are all interlinked in profound ways. And so let me begin by marking just a couple of the ways in which the question of the human, not merely the human, but the question of the human, what the human is and what the human is for, has sat at the very root of the project of biotechnology for the last at least 50 years. This is a quote from Robert Sinsheimer, who was a major figure in the rise of molecular biology. He was for a while the president of University of California at Santa Cruz, a major figure. A new eugenics would permit in principle the conversion of all the unfit to the highest genetic level, for we should have the means to create new genes and new qualities yet undreamed. This is at the moment, this is in 1969, this is the moment where the very first tools of biotechnology were coming into being, and with them an imagination of the capacity to no longer just describe life, but to intervene in it. Defined genetic improvement of man is a means to carry on and consciously perfect the human species. So this is a technological project, but I want to point to also how this is an imagination of perfectibility. There's a language of perfectibility, an idiom of perfectibility that sits inside of it. And therefore also an idea of purpose, an idea of the good. Here's another more simple but far-reaching formulation. This is from Julian Huxley, who was probably the most important evolutionary biologist in the 20th century. At a 1962 conference that was organized by Joshua Lederberg, a Nobel laureate, another luminary in 20th century biosciences, on man and his future, in which the sort of great scientific thinkers of the day got together and asked the question, whither the human? And this, Huxley said, was the foundational question that had to orient the sort of technological projects that they were there to discuss. What are people for? And yet take note that it was the people who studied microorganisms and were developing novel synthetic biochemicals that were asking the question, what are people for? So fast forward a half century, and we find ourselves at a moment in the biosciences when the kinds of things that were imaginable are closer. Imagination still runs riot and still plays a profound role. This is not merely about what we can do, but what we aspire to do and what we think we will be able to do. But let me give you this just as an example. This is a collection of primordial cells of so-called pluripotent stem cells, the sort of cells that are kind of one level of differentiation up from the first cell that we all began from, placed on a plate that places physical constraints on those cells. And lo and behold, these cells self-organize into something that looks remarkably like an early embryo. So this is a very early version of a synthetic human embryo. And this has raised these new capacities, which are expanding very, very rapidly right now, have raised, on the one hand, a sort of sense of the thrilling power of being able to artificially construct, reproduce a complex living system, in fact, a human system, the human system at its inception. But it's also raised this question. Well, you know, when do we cross a threshold? When does this collection of cells transition into something of moral significance? So how human is too human? But then there's the question of how do we ask that question anyway? In what ways do we imagine the human such that that question comes to make sense? It's a problem that can be solved. And so I want us to ask what or whose account of the human, not just sort of what's the right answer to the question of in what sense is this human, but who gets to say what counts as the right sort of answer? What sort of answer counts as an answer, right? That in the formulation of a problem, one constructs the kind of answer that can solve the problem. One delimits the nature of the problem that one is contending with. So that's sort of at one end of the spectrum, the most sort of an intervention into the most rudimentary, basic, primordial, and yet sort of pregnant with significance human organism. At the other end of the spectrum is the application to very old, as old as we are, modes of procreation, the incorporation into those of the new tools of biotechnology to remake the human in some fundamental sense. For example, through direct re-engineering of the genome, direct intervention in the genome of a human embryo that will go on to be a baby and a person, in the name of shaping that life, that trajectory. So I want to differentiate three different types of human that are at stake here. Three different levels at which the human is at stake. And the first one is the most familiar. So the meanings of projects in science and technology for human life. The impacts and consequences. What will AI do to humans? So Luisa Damiano, a couple of days ago, or was it yesterday? No, 2 days ago, sort of pointed to this kind of concern, referencing Sherry Turkle's notion that, you know, the incorporation of affective robots into, you know, nurseries or whatever will somehow attenuate the human. That it's a sort of ontology of the human, there is the human, and that human is placed at risk by these sort of technological intrusions. But take note that these ways of thinking about impacts and consequences sort of present technology as though it comes from nowhere. There is the human world, in comes technology and reshapes it in some sort of fundamental way. And these are absolutely worth worrying about, absolutely. But we also have to recognize that those technologies don't come from nowhere. They themselves are animated by an idea of the human for which these technologies are a benefit. It is that idea of the human that authorizes those technologies. So this is not just a kind of ontological, but a moral conception of the human. The human that is in need of these goods that can be brought to it. This is the human that sits at the center of imaginations of progress and the good, and authorizes projects that are undertaken in the name of those projects. You know, when Cliff yesterday was talking about the validation of this sort of what he was decrying, the sort of validation of ancient Buddhist practices by looking into the fMRI or the EEG to see if they really work, as if that's where the true human resides. It strikes me that this is an example of that kind of transmutation, where a human is a different sort of imagination of the human is emerging and disciplining the ways of thinking and the very practices, the things that we find meaningful in particular contexts, subjecting them to different kinds of criteria of evaluation, different judgments of value and of goodness. He referred to this as sort of reflective. Sorry? Oh, no, that's right. That's what should be up there. I'm just looking at my notes. So he referred to this as sort of reflective of differing social imaginaries. I wouldn't have used this term, but since he brought it in, I'm going to use it. I would amend that slightly to say that social imaginaries are almost always socio-technical imaginaries. That they're not just ideas that are in our heads, conceptual landscapes that we share between each other on a kind of intellectual level. They're not merely worldviews, but they're also worlds, right? Because they are enacted. They come to take the form of technological systems, of technological regimes, of modes of knowledge that have effects, felt effects, in our lives and in our world. So it's not just, an idea, but it's the iPhone itself. Or the device that counts the bird tweets. It's in the construction of educational curricula that imagine a particular kind of human and its perfectibility, the forms of progress appropriate to it, and then enforce that and produce humans of that sort, whether rightly or wrongly. It's in policies that rely on nudges to fix our defective capacities for decision making. Pick your site, and there's an imagination of the human that is incipient in the material and epistemic regimes that we are embedded in, and that shape us and configure us and produce us in profoundly consequential ways. So those ideas have consequences. Those ideas have a life, not only in our sort of idea sphere, but in our material existences as well. Okay, and the last way, and in some sense this is the most difficult, but I think the most important, is the way the human is at stake in ways of being together. So the question of the human in whose name the project is undertaken is a political question. And the ways of asking and answering that question, and that question gets asked and answered all the time, whether we recognize it or not. The ways of asking and answering that question are constitutive of our political order, our ways of being together, our modes of collective sense-making, our shared moral imaginations, our collective normative vocabularies, our shared aspirations and imaginations of progress, and very importantly, the enactment of forms of authority and the exercise of power associated with those. The judgments that get made, who makes those judgments, who is empowered to transform the human, how, why, and with what effects, and in what ways, usually that's a small minority, in what ways are the rest of us in a sort of position of deference to those modes of judgment. So those political relations, both in the sort of modes of thinking and speaking together, and in the modes of asymmetries in the authority to act, are essential. That is one absolutely essential locus of the human. And for this I want to use a wonderful sentence from Hannah Arendt, one of the best philosophers, most wonderful philosophers of the 20th century in my opinion, writing actually on a set of technological transformations that we're worrying over now. There were three in her list. One was the launch of Sputnik, the colonization of space. Another was the transformation, and the two others that she thought were actually more important, were the transformation of labor through automation, the removal of work, that foundational sort of constitutive existential dimension of human existence, its displacement to machines, what that would mean for the human, and the project of making the human a site of biotechnological intervention. She didn't exactly use that word, but it was making life in the laboratory. And what she worried about was the ways in which these projects entailed a kind of reimagining, a shifting relation to the human, which was a shifting political relation that would produce a kind of incapacity, an inability for us to understand, that is to think and speak about the things which we are nevertheless able to do. So the thinking and speaking, the capacity to think and speak, is itself constitutive of the human in important ways. And so what I want to do is go through three sort of vignettes, little snapshots. These are very superficial little snapshots of things that are much larger, but hopefully they give the flavor. Three ways of thinking and speaking that are constitutive of our technological moment, that have brought that technological moment into being, and shape not just the human that's impacted, and not just the imagination of the human in whose name these projects are undertaken, but also our very relations, our ways of being together that bring about the technological worlds that we're coming to inhabit. And so these three sort of correspond to each of those three versions of the human, more or less. So first of all, delimiting problems. Okay, so like I said, there are capacities in biotechnology that allow interventions into the most basic stuff of life, and therefore transgressions of the most basic boundaries, morally significant, simple, straightforward distinctions that are at the same time deeply morally significant distinctions, for example, between human and non-human, raising questions that are at once difficult conceptual questions about how to think about these distinctions now that they're perturbable, but also very practical questions like, can you do this experiment? And usually the questions are raised in the context of that kind of practical question. Here's a discussion that I was involved in. This is a paper that came out of a laboratory at Harvard, where the question was basically, well, what is the human in a sort of material and morphological sense? I mean, what is the relationship between that and the human's moral significance? Because, hey, we're developing the capacities to make morphologically human things out of human biological materials, and we can make them this complete or this complete. We can make the quasi-brain in isolation or embedded in a relation to a sense of sensory organs, etc. That there's a sort of the possibility for the direct engineering of human biological parts and wholes, and we want to know where we ought not go. This was a very difficult discussion, a very inconclusive discussion. What was fascinating about this discussion was this sort of sense that we didn't even understand where to begin the discussion, what the right question was. In fact, interestingly, the question around this issue tends to be, well, what can the entity that you're talking about do? And if you can tell us that, then we can tell you whether you shouldn't have made it. But of course, the question was framed around a set of technical possibilities, not a existing product. So it was a where should we not go, not, does this thing fall into this box versus that box. The recommendation that came out of that discussion was, don't make conscious things, whatever that means. What is consciousness anyway, right? Here's another example. This is a relatively simple but quite provocative experiment in which human glial progenitor cells, certain brain cell, were integrated into mice who grew up and were better at running through mazes. They were more intelligent mice. And so the sort of question was, are these mice or are these something else? And what I want to draw attention to here is who gets to answer that question and in what terms. The way these questions tend to get asked in the processes of sort of mundane oversight of research is by counting cells. Well, if it's a 30% contribution, probably it's a mouse, right? Well, even if it's a 60% contribution, but it's in the architecture of a mouse, it's still probably a mouse. Perhaps. But the sort of what is it question precedes the what ought we do. Should it have been done? Should it be done? is there something that's at stake here? And here's the lead author on this study. This does not provide the animals with additional capabilities that could in any way be ascribed or perceived as specifically human. Rather, the human cells are simply improving the efficiency of the mouse's own neural networks. It's still a mouse. It's still a mouse, and therefore there's nothing to talk about here, people. This is an exercise of expertise, take note. This is the expert, the person who can make a judgment about this, or one of a very small number of people who can make an ostensibly expert judgment about this, that shuts down a conversation about whether it means something because it's just a mouse. So this is delimitation through definition. This is shrinking the circle of the questions that need asking by declaring that what you're talking about here is not this, but just this. It's something small. And these are from some interviews that I conducted with oversight bodies that, that oversee this kind of research, just a few little samples, pointing out that move is on the one hand sort of determines everything, and on the other hand is sort of radically incomplete, and we don't know what the hell to do about it, but we're just not going to pay attention to that too much, please. Even if there's a human contribution to the mouse, you're not going to get a mouse that sits up and reads the paper. So you go from counting cells, from making arguments about, you know, the analogy between this altered brain and the wild type mouse brain. You shift directly from that register to making jokes about, you know, little mice driving little cars, the mouse reading the newspaper, the mouse talking to you when you come into the laboratory in the morning, and so forth. And I take this as a sort of a way of contending with humor, through humor, with the kind of intractability of a problem that the group of people overseeing this problem simply don't know how to contend with. They simply do not have the vocabulary to contend with it. And yet they set up a regime of measurement that in effect guarantees that no question will ever actually arise because the mouse will remain a mouse. Mouse behavior is difficult to ascertain, laughs. You find what you look for and what you can measure, and what can you measure with a mouse? I just want to point out the sort of homologies between this and some things that Federico and Cameron said on their first day. You know, the construction of quantum theory is information theory, the delimitation of ways of asking questions of economic value through a very circumscribed construction of value. I mean, these are moments of delimitation through definition, in which that first move is what shapes everything that's downstream. What world is possible is a function of the parameters, the finis, the fence that you've put around the kinds of questions that you can ask, the ways of talking about the problem that you can engage. And this approach has been foundational for the rise of biotechnology. At its very inception, very significant questions about sort of taking liberties with life, the control and transformation of life, big political questions emerged in big P political spheres. And though there's a significant variation between how these were dealt with in different parts of the world, in the US, where the sort of foundations were most profoundly laid, the way they were addressed were by converting those into questions of biohazards, technical questions, and making them therefore the problems that belong to the very small group of experts who are in a position to decide them, who also, by the way, happen to be the experts who are undertaking the projects. And so scientific self-regulation became a kind of imperative because no one else was competent to regulate on these kinds of matters of technical assessment, where you were asking, is the experiment safe? So here we are, decades later, asking the question about the mouse experiment. Is the mouse experiment safe? Is there a risk that the mouse becomes something other than a mouse? Well, no, because we know what a mouse is. We know how to define and measure a mouse. And we're going to define and measure this mouse to make sure that it's a mouse. What are the effects of these ways of thinking and talking? So risk, the discourse of risk, the primacy of risk, becomes a technology-specific problem of containment, of making sure that the technology doesn't have unintended consequences, where you, by the way, are beginning with a very narrow set of intentions, and so anything unintended is really what was left unthought. It was maybe perfectly visible from the moment of the inception, except that you defined the problem such that you couldn't see it. So risk is a technology-specific problem of containment where you ask questions about the specific technology, the specific experiment, in very narrow terms about health and safety, et cetera, and refuse the big questions, the questions of what are people for example, and how does this technology, this project fit into a larger imagination of human place, purpose, and the good. This narrows the parameters of deliberation. It also constructs a kind of a power relation. Science speaks first, ethics second. By ethics, I mean all of the unauthorized, non-expert idioms in which you might ask questions of the good. Those only come in when an expert has said, actually, maybe this mouse is not a mouse. Now what do we do? Okay. Now that door is open. But the exercise of control over conversation through science speaking first and science usually saying there's nothing to talk about here is profound and has been foundational for the development of biotechnology. This also means that there's an asymmetrical treatment of risk and benefit. So that risks are always delimited, they're always narrow, they're always attached to the single experiment, to the particular technology, they're always short timeline. Whereas imaginations of benefit are vast. Biotechnology will transform food security, health, energy. It's going to save us. The possibilities are infinite. But the risks, they're very delimited. That's a remarkable asymmetry. It's worth reflecting upon. That, by the way, is sort of, just sort of part and parcel of the discourse. So I want to capture these relations schematically in this, a very sort of familiar story, a story which has been foundational to the sort of development of big science in the 20th century, post-World War II. The notion that we go from basic to applied to the market, from science to technology to society. If we think about this not as a account of how technological change happens, because it's a false account and a vast amount of work has demonstrated definitively that it's a false account. Society is right there in the science and technology and the imaginations of what needs knowing and what should be done, etc. But if we see this instead as a sort of set of political relations between different forms of institutional authority and different ways of talking, well, you can see how the projects of knowledge and technology sit upstream of the projects of asking what are they for. And therefore, you find yourself in a position of only being able to ask what they're for after they're already here or they're upon us. The question of what are they for becomes reactive rather than proactive, right? Sort of modulating and rather than constitutive. Okay, so second story, imagining progress. So I said there's this asymmetry between constructions of risk and constructions of benefit. This is a report put out by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, one of the most sort of august scientific bodies in the world, envisioning what the future of the life sciences looks like in the 20th century, the so-called new biology. The story is a story of convergence between the disciplines, between physics and computer science, chemistry and biology, where biology becomes the site, the focus of all of these different techniques. Biology becomes, for example, an information science, but in which the very stuff of life can be transformed through the tools of informatic control and innovation. And this is the framing of the report, that the new biology will enunciate and address broad and challenging societal problems. It will address, it will provide the solutions. We're used to now this discourse of problems and technological solutions. But the enunciate is remarkable, is it not? The new biology will declare what we need and provide it to us. It will imagine progress. It will articulate the good. It will say what human beings need, what society needs, and in that sense also say where society ought to be going. So I want to draw out a couple of ways of telling stories about progress that have become quite consequential. So this is a statement from Ray Kurzweil, who is a sort of figure somewhat controversial figure in Silicon Valley. He's a sort of leading figure in the world of transhumanism. And what I want to point to is not so much Kurzweil as an authority, but rather Kurzweil as capturing and speaking quite loudly a particular kind of discourse that's all over the place. So this is a sensibility that's not specific to him, but he's become a kind of mouthpiece for him. The essence of being human is not our limitations, although we do have many. It's our ability to reach beyond our limitations. Well, that's a quite inspiring statement, right? But the expression of reaching beyond our limitations is this. This is Kurzweil's curve of exponential technology, the sort of notion that the most important, the right way to mark history is in terms of technological developments, and that this is not a linear progression, but an exponential one. And that we are at the sort of inflection of a curve that is headed towards radical transformations of the human, the transformation of consciousness itself into a sort of, something like the cloud, through technological architectures, through advances in computing. It's a story about the history of the world. It's also a story about the world being a world of information, being meaningless in precisely the ways that Federico talked about, and being made meaningful through the projects that the human undertakes that transform the human into something else, into the transhuman. And that is the expression, that is itself the expression of progress. And that this is a kind of theological vision, and yet at the same time, it's just plain old vanilla marking out of a natural law, a law of technological change. Kurzweil likes to say, you look at this curve, it's remarkably smooth, but here's a world war, here's another world war, here are these major moments of social dislocation. They're irrelevant. The technological change happens regardless. We are the noise that surrounds a kind of technological trajectory that drives itself. These ideas have appeared in other places, been taken up in some sense. Kurzweil is a popularizer of this idea of exponential innovation. This is the sort of framing project, and has been for several years, of the World Economic Forum, the idea that there is a fourth industrial revolution that's currently unfolding, in which the convergence of these different domains of knowledge and technique produce a fundamental transformation of economy and of industry, but also of life and the human itself. And that these forces of technological change demand not just recognition and affirmation, but political reorientation. Because our ways of governing ourselves, our ways of being together as social and political communities will be rendered obsolete by these forms of technological transformation. This is a story. And this is affecting, whether it's true or not, in a sense, doesn't matter. There are many reasons to be highly skeptical of these predictions. And yet at the same time, you see these macro scale transformations in modes of governance that are responsive to the prediction that they're going to be obsolete. They're trying to get ahead of the curve by changing themselves in reaction to a future that may or may not happen. I think that there's something actually quite poignant about the ways in which at the core of these imaginations sits a kind of confrontation with human vulnerability and human mortality, and that actually the sort of imagination is of a kind of redemption, but a redemption that we achieve for ourselves. Immortality is in our grasp. This is a book by Ray Kurzweil, whose subtitle, I think, is actually the most important part of the book. Live long enough to live forever. Stay with the progress of technology long enough that you will become immortal. But these are not little marginal, these are the sort of fantasies of a particular group of techno enthusiasts. But some of those techno enthusiasts have a lot of money and are cultural agenda setters. This is the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook's philanthropic project. And this is its mission: to cure all diseases. This is Calico. It's a company, it's a Google company. And given our discussions of mystery, I really liked this formulation. We're tackling aging, one of life's greatest mysteries. I don't know. I mean, there are other traditions of the mysterious. We're in a place in which this form of contemplation, maybe around these words, which began only a few years after those words were composed somewhere nearby here, is worth reflecting upon. This is, of course, from St. Francis's Canticle of the Sun. Praise be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no living man can escape. I mean, that's quite a profound, demands a kind of profound reflection that is profoundly at odds with these ideas of the human as somehow a disease that's in need of a cure, where our sort of vulnerability and mortality itself is in that repertoire of diseases that hopefully we will cure in the near future. This is a statement from Pope Francis that I think captures our political moment in quite a nice way. In contemporary culture, we often tend to consider that the only real truth to be that of technology. Truth is what we succeed in building and measuring by our scientific know-how. Truth is what works and what makes life easier and more comfortable. Nowadays, this appears as the only truth that is certain, the only truth that can be shared, the only truth that can serve as a basis for discussion or for common undertakings. It is the way we think and speak, and therefore the way we understand, or fail to understand, the things that we're nevertheless able to do. Okay, so what sort of political formations does this bring into being, and what futures thereby get enacted? So I want to return to this story. If people have been paying attention to the remarkable developments in this domain over the last sort of 3 years or 6 months, they've been remarkable. This is, of course, the discussions around the project of applying new and very powerful tools of very precise modification of genomes, any kind of genome, including the human genome, the application of those tools to human embryos in order to bring into being transformed people. Genetic engineering of human beings. This is a statement made at the opening of a gathering in 2015, the International Summit on Human Gene Editing by David Baltimore, Nobel laureate, former president of Caltech, about the situation we find ourselves in. The unthinkable has become conceivable. The unthinkable, the possibility of directly managing and modifying ourselves and our evolutionary trajectory. Biological, but I would say also social and moral and political. It's worth actually reflecting for a moment on why that was unthinkable. Because after all, Hannah Arendt was thinking about that in 1958. But it couldn't be done, and therefore was not thought about. It was declared out of bounds because the scientific criteria for asking the ethical questions hadn't yet been met, right? But now the unthinkable has become conceivable, and therefore now Baltimore, a very prominent scientist, declares, now we must face the questions that arise. How, if at all, do we as a society want to use this capability? Take note of the we as a society. I mean, who is that we that's getting invoked? And what sort of authority resides in that we? What are the terms of debate and engagement, the shared idiom, the modes of coming together of that we? Who's in and who's out of that we? Here he is speaking at the summit. Once again, this is the trajectory from science to technology to society. We have gone from decades of science to the advent of a technology that's right on the threshold of society, and now it's time to talk about it, right? Whereas in fact, that science was animated by an idea of purpose and progress and the good, and the questions were live. These very questions were live long before the moment of practical technological possibility came into being. And yet, so here are a set of stories that are told about the relationships between these different elements, science, technology, and society. They're truisms. These are, if you open your ears, you'll hear that these are repeated everywhere as the sort of defining and delimiting parameters, the premises, the postulates of discussion about what we can or cannot do. These are the structures that configure the forms of agency. Yet we agentially impose those structures upon ourselves by saying that these are the limited conditions under which we have the freedom to act. This is Marcia McNutt, president of the National Academy of Sciences, speaking about human genome editing. As is always the case, the speed at which science is advancing outpaces society's ability to grasp its implications. Science races ahead, society lags behind. The best we can do is react to things that are coming or have already come. What does that mean for us? This is a story of inevitability. I didn't attribute the speaker to this, but he's a very prominent scientist. But it doesn't sort of matter who he is, because this is said all over the place by all sorts of different actors. Germline editing is going to happen. That is, heritable human genetic engineering is going to happen. And to think otherwise is naive. There's nothing to talk about here except how we go about doing it, because it's coming. The technology is going to bring itself about no matter what we say or do. This is the co-chair of a National Academies committee that basically has written what are supposed to be the rules for how to govern this new domain of science and technology. He's a scientist. There's been a line drawn by many that says you should refrain. So for decades, it was sort of like beyond question that you don't engineer the germline. You don't go there. Right? Heritable genetic engineering is a no-go. We're in a country that more than 20 years ago signed an international treaty that committed to that as a categorical prohibition, along with 29 other countries in Europe. So there's been a line drawn by many that says you should refrain. That was mostly because there was no way of considering how to do that at all. So nobody was arguing that it should be done. So the impossibility becomes the norm. We can't do it, therefore we ought not do it. If we can't be done, it shouldn't be done. But then it flips. Suddenly it can be done. And if it can be done, it should be done. If it can be done, it will be done. So it should be done. It should be done the right way, not the wrong way. But whether or not it should be done is not a question, because, you know, history has brought us to this place. But of course, we brought ourselves to this place. So this is a journalist's take on what that report, of which Richard Hines was a co-chair, said. The US panel endorses designer babies to avoid serious disease. So basically what the report says is, yeah, this is going to happen, and it should happen, and okay, we can set some parameters for how it should happen, and it shouldn't happen yet, but it should happen, right? So now it's happened. If people have been following this story. But in late November, news came out from a young Chinese researcher that he had not only genetically modified human embryos, which others have done as well, but he had created pregnancies that had produced babies. Okay, so there are now genetically engineered people in the world. Where did that come from? I want to use this. So there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, what was he thinking? He went rogue. He shouldn't have done this, or should he or shouldn't he done this? He clearly shouldn't have done this, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of judgment. But there's not been a lot of reflection about how did this happen? Out of what world did this project arise? And in what ways are the rest of us implicated in it? And so if we step back and we ask that question, well, they're actually pretty familiar, the forces that gave rise to this project. Number one was, of course, the idea that it was inevitable. It was going to happen. But that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy insofar as people walk right up to the brink and stop. This is a very prominent researcher who's based at a university in Oregon, who a couple of years ago in 2017 undertook a project in which he created a large number of human embryos using sperm from a person who is a carrier of a genetic disease in order to see if he could repair those embryos. So he didn't create pregnancies, but of course, you know, in a world of reproductive technology, initiating a pregnancy is the technically most trivial part of this process. There are thousands upon thousands of people who know how to do that, right? So he took it right up to that limit. And what did he get for it? He got a paper in Nature, which is like the holy grail of the scientific professions, right? What else? Well, this guy, this Chinese researcher whose name is He Jiankui, thought about what role, what place does somebody like him potentially play in the history of science. And so he looked to the history of science and the kinds of stories that are told about heroes in the history of science to guide for his own moral compass, to guide the process of thinking through whether it was appropriate to do this. By the way, he talked to a lot of people about this, and he did not get condemnation. In many cases, he got affirmation. He even got offers of investment, capital. But this is one of the key stories that he looked to. The story of the first birth of a child through radically novel technological means that was done in secret, maybe without sufficient preclinical research, released, made known to the world through sort of sensational popular media, not through a scientific outlet. That, of course, was the birth of the first baby through in vitro fertilization, Louise Brown, in the UK in 1978, which was the project of these two people, Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe. A few years ago, Robert Edwards won the Nobel Prize for that work. Patrick Steptoe had died, so he was no longer eligible because it's not awarded posthumously. So work that was profoundly consequential for a period of time that gave rise to a technology that came to be normalized, even if in very different ways in different societies, is in retrospect, decades later, valorized as heroic work, as the work of a pioneer. Not just a scientific pioneer, but a kind of moral pioneer. This guy imagined himself as following the same, repeating history, following the same trajectory. So, as it happens, I know this guy, and I've had, after the kind of global firestorm that emerged around his research in late November, I had a series of extended conversations with him, sort of playing the listener. I have no training in psychoanalysis, but I managed to pull it off okay. Playing the listener to his account of how this came about. And one of the key things that he said was profoundly influential for him was being in a room as a very junior person, with a group of about 20 of the most prominent scientists in the world, including one of the developers, discoverers of CRISPR-Cas9, the technology that we're talking about. The luminaries. As it happens, I was also in that room, and so the two of us were by far the most junior people. And somebody said, a very senior person said this, and he remembered it, and I also, when he said this, remembered this being said. It's in my notes as well. And he thought about this, and this became a sort of warrant, a motivation, but also a sort of authorization to undertake what he undertook. Most major breakthroughs are made by one or a couple of scientists. You need someone to break the glass. He said to me, so I broke the glass. The top statement is something that was also uttered in that meeting. The bottom one is from another very prominent person. These are other things that he reported to me he had reflected upon. So these are his paraphrases of things that other people of major prominence told him. Once someone makes the first healthy kid, the entire society will speed up and write new rules. So science races ahead, society lags behind. Science has an obligation to race ahead so that society can right itself and catch up. So that our norms, our ideas, our imaginations of the human and the good can adjust themselves to fit with true progress, which emanates from the project of science. Don't worry about the ethics. In 5 to 10 years, everything will change. Weather the controversy, and then everything will be all right. We'll see. I think it remains plausible that this villain becomes a hero. Just to give you a sense of how this is not just sort of a sensibility, a sort of warped sensibility in the mind of an ambitious young Chinese scientist, but is at the sort of center of bioscience itself. Here is a statement that was put out a couple of months ago by some of the most significant figures in genetics, including the director of the Broad Institute at Harvard. It was endorsed by the director of the US National Institutes of Health, calling for a moratorium. 5 years, nobody makes any babies. No questions asked. There's no criteria, there's no set of justifications. By the way, one thing I forgot to say was that the report that said eventually, the National Academy's report that said eventually the babies are going to happen and these criteria just have to be met. He Zhanghui basically looked at those criteria and said, well, I think I meet those criteria, and who the hell are these guys to decide whether I meet those criteria? So I'm judging this for myself and I'm moving ahead. So this sort of moratorium suggestion was a response to that kind of dynamic, saying, no, there are no criteria, there's just a categorical prohibition. There's a sense in which there's a consensus position that this shouldn't be done for the moment. But nevertheless, this suggestion that we call it a moratorium and we formalize it has elicited enormous pushback. Here's pushback from David Baltimore again. With a science that's moving forward as rapidly as this science is, which direction is forward, by the way? That seems to be beyond question. It seems to be simply given. With a science that's moving forward as rapidly as this science is, you want to be able to adapt to new discoveries, new opportunities, and new understandings. To make rules is probably not a good idea. This is from this week's Nature. CRISPR babies. When will the world be ready? The world is the problem. The babies aren't. So what should we take from this? Well, my take home is pretty simple. Number one is we have to be able to see these things. We have to be able to see these dynamics, these configurations of authority and power, which live not just in resources, not just in prestige, but also in the kinds of monopolies that get formed around around imaginations of progress, and who gets to narrate them, and who is therefore authorized to enact them, and whose dissenting imaginations can be shoved out of the picture as ignorant, as lagging behind, as somehow not tuned in to the nature of things. Progress, in my view, requires precisely the opposite of that kind of hubris. It requires ambivalence. It requires seeing the multiple valences. It requires uncertainty rather than certitude. It requires a sense of instability in relation to these emerging powers, and therefore the forms of humility that sense of instability engenders. And in a very fundamental sense, I think being human depends upon it. So, as is the case with many of the things that I find myself saying, I often find a place where a poet has said it much more succinctly and much more powerfully. This is from T.S. Eliot's Choruses from the Rock. And I find in these words a sort of prescient. Our age is an age of moderate virtue and moderate vice, of asking the question, is this mouse a mouse? Not, what are we doing here? Of asking, how can we do this? Not, what are we doing? Of narrowing down the vocabularies that we're required to use to think and speak such that we can have attenuated forms of understanding that pass for understanding, rather than asking ourselves, how is it that we think and speak? And how is it that we constitute ourselves as humans and as a human community by virtue of those modes of speaking? Out of the meaningless practical shapes of all that is living or lifeless, the soul of man must quicken to creation out of the meaningless practical shapes of all that is living or lifeless. I think that we find ourselves in a moment where we ask small questions about large matters, and where certainty is achievable only because a problem has been constructed to be solvable. But as Luigi put very beautifully the other day, mysteries are not problems. And I would add that it is at our peril, and at the peril of the human being itself, that we render mysteries into problems and set ourselves the task of solving them. Thank you very much.